everyone. Thank you for joining us today, lending your time and your voices to this important discussion. I'm Ngozi Odita, and I'm founder of Africa Next, and we're the organizers of today's forum. And Africa Next exists to be a space both online and offline that celebrates African ingenuity and empowers creatives, entrepreneurs, organizers, and all around remarkable people who are very interested in moving Africa forward. We believe that creating spaces where we can gather and connect and collaborate is of the utmost importance, and also creates opportunities for us to generate ideas and strategies that help uplift and transform our communities and industries and the continent in general. And we also believe that Africa's greatest strength is its people, and it's also its greatest resources. And we see Black people everywhere, no matter where you're from or where you reside, where you originated. We're all African, and in this moment, it's so important for us as Black people everywhere to see ourselves in each other. And as you know, if one person is being effective, an attack on any Black person is an attack on all of us. And that really kind of gets to the heart of why we are gathering here today. Essentially, Black lives are being threatened all over in the world, all over the world. You know, a lot of the focus right now, we're dealing with a lot of things that are happening within the US, but the same issues that we deal with in the US is happening across Africa, is happening in Latin America, it's happening in Europe. You know, it's really happening everywhere. Like Black people are dealing with not just police violence, but injustices as it relates to healthcare, as it relates to just policies, criminalization of communities. So this really is just really widespread and is a pandemic on its own. So we're hoping by gathering here today, you'll soon be hearing from an amazing group of people who are going to kind of share their insights and the work that they do and the impact that they're having and strategies that we can employ ourselves. So we'll start off with a panel, and then following the panel, we will have a roundtable discussions in smaller groups that'll allow all of us to like really begin to think collaboratively about how we want to transform the communities that we're in, and how we want the communities and how we want police and state and policies to serve our interests as Black people, and ultimately how we want to be able to be free, safe, and prosper in this world as Black people. So a few housekeeping things. One is everybody is currently on mute. And so if you have any questions you have for the panelists, please put them in the chat. We'll be gathering all those questions for later. Again, definitely introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know where you are listening from. And the hashtags for the event are hashtag BLM United We Stand and hashtag Africa NXT. So, without further ado, we are going to get started with the first part of the program, which is the panel. And we have 4 amazing people with us this afternoon or evening, or if you're on the West Coast in America, morning still. So we first have Andre Perry. He is a fellow, part of the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institute in the United States. We also have Monifa Bandele, who is the policy leader for the Movement for Black Lives. We have Nomsa Mazwai from South Africa, who's a social activist, a Fulbright scholar, and founder of Funkitimwalking. And then we have Yemi Ademelokun, who is from Nigeria. She's the executive director of Enough is Enough. Asa Torre, who was supposed to be joining us from France, unfortunately has an emergency and she will not be with us today. So we'll move forward, and I'll let everybody introduce themselves. And if you can just introduce yourself and then essentially say how your work is kind of impacted by this moment, or how are you perceiving this moment informed by your work. And we'll start off with Monifa. Monifa, can you? Oh, I have to unmute you. Yes, that would be important. Okay, I've asked to unmute you.
Okay, now I can unmute myself.
Yes.
Peace, everyone. Thank you so much, Ngozi, for pulling together this panel. Our work is international, and we need to always remember that. That's something that our elders and mentors have always taught us. And so thank you for continuing to convene and to have these conversations. My name is Monifa Bandele. I am a leader on the policy table for the Movement for Black Lives, and we are being hugely impacted by this moment. The Movement for Black Lives is an ecosystem of 150 Black-led organizations from all over the United States. We also work in alliance with organizations around the world. We came out of the Ferguson uprisings back in 2014 and have built an infrastructure and a network that has really brought us to where we are today. Many of our organizations in different cities and states have been fighting different aspects of police violence since before Ferguson. In fact, some for decades and some for 2 decades. And Ngozi and I go back to the early 2000s doing cop watch in New York City in the wake of the killing of Amadou Diallo. And what we've learned over these past 2 decades, and especially these past 7 years, is that tinkering around the edges of police reform doesn't prevent Black death. It doesn't defend Black lives. And in fact, when we put money into things like police training and trying to figure out ways to make better, friendlier policing, we end up throwing a lot of good money behind that. So our movement has taken a firm stand and has emerged over the last month with a national call to defund the police, essentially saying that we need to divest from policing infrastructures, from criminalization infrastructures, from prisons, from jails, and we need to invest those resources into the infrastructure that we know makes our communities safe: affordable housing, mental health services, healthcare, education, all of the things that have been starved because our cities and states dump billions, tens of billions of dollars into policing. So this moment has been very powerful for us. Coming out of the death of George Floyd, we have been marching in the streets in every state in the United States sustainably now for 6 weeks. We had a Juneteenth mobilization that had 600 separate demonstrations and rallies across the country. Many cities continue to be daily to this day. Just yesterday, I'll finish by saying we launched a piece of federal legislation called the Breathe Act. And this is a piece of legislation coming from activists, as well as the mothers of Mike Brown and the mother of Eric Garner, essentially saying, now's not the time to figure out the 12,000th way that you can ban chokeholds. Chokeholds have been banned in different cities for decades, and still our folks get choked to death. How do we reduce policing, take away the power and the money from an institution that cannot be held accountable to our communities? So if you get an opportunity, check out the Breathe Act. It's called thebreatheact.org. We just threw up a separate website, but you can also link to it at m4bl.org.
Thank you. Nomsa, you can go next.
Hi, I'm Mazwai, and I'm from South Africa. I am the founder of Funkitimwalking. And the reason why I founded Funkitimwalking was because when I came back from the US where I did my master's, I realized that in South Africa it's very difficult to walk, especially for women. And so the organization aims to make it safe for women to walk at any time of day, in any condition. And so at the beginning, the walks were mostly activism driven. So there was a theme around the walks. So when we started doing the walks with Funkitimwalking, we were walking for a purpose. So it was one walk that we did was for the autopsy report for Steve Biko not to be auctioned, because that's what they were going to, that was the plan, they were going to auction the autopsy report. But more recently, it's been more about how do we make our community safer, because in South Africa, we don't have the freedom to walk. And that's due to the high levels of crime in our country. And so the organization is working with community policing forums and also looking at ways to work with the police, because the police in South Africa, before apartheid, the narrative of the police hasn't really changed. So they're not part of the community, they're not adding any value. Well, the experience is that they're not adding any value. You know, when you see the police in the street, you don't feel safe. You rather feel like you don't want to be victimized. And that's as a Black person in general. And the police are over-policing in Black areas. So Funkitimwalking focuses on townships. At the moment, our work is primarily in Soweto. And so it's more about how do we create communities where we can walk. And so that's the work that I'm doing. And at the moment, in this moment with COVID-19 and coronavirus, we've really seen how police in South Africa victimize people with the lockdown, because we saw more acts of police violence in Black communities. And so, you know, that comes into our work in terms of really looking at, if people can't walk, can't enjoy their environments, then how can we say that we are actually free?
Thank you. Andre, you can go next. Oh.
Yes, hi, my name is Andre Perry. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution, where I study majority cities. I specifically examine the assets in Black community cities that are undervalued or devalued because of racism. And then I seek to identify that lost value so we can begin to restore it economically to Black communities that have essentially been robbed by racism in a number of areas. As was mentioned, the defund police example or movement is a great example of how investment in policing does not lead to economic or social mobility. It literally arrests it. And so the goal is to move money from organizations that suppress or stifle economic and social mobility and move those funds to people so that they can live healthy lives, and that money can help build strong communities. So I have a new book out, Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black City, that details how wealth has been extracted from communities through things like policing, through housing discrimination, through job discrimination. But the whole point of the book is to say, hey, here's the amount of money that will take to restore value to communities that are constantly being robbed by racism.
Thank you. And Yemi?
Right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Yemi. I am in Lagos, Nigeria. I'm Executive Director of Enough is Enough, Nigeria. Not an organization I founded, not an organization that had a plan. It basically came out of a protest. And over the last 10 years, it's basically worked to get citizens in Nigeria to understand their rights and responsibilities and hold government accountable. So the moment is interesting for me as an individual, and I guess contextually for our organization, because it's over the last, I guess, for example, 5 years that I've really paid attention to the history of policing in the US and sort of understanding the context of why the framing around police brutality. So it's not, so the conversations around that police officers are also Black. So why is this an issue? But if one understands policing in the US was within the context of slavery and the fact that they were designed to operate in a particular way, then what we see now shouldn't be surprising. But you take that across the oceans and come to the continent, and it's quite different. Majority Black nation that Nigeria is, but we still see a lot of police brutality as well. Police is definitely not your friend. And I think as Nomsa was saying, you see the police, you tend to be afraid. But the interesting thing that's different from sort of defunding the police is that in Nigeria, we're more likely to say that the police need to be funded, because a big part of their brutality and their aggression is because as human beings, they've been dehumanized. So they live in barracks, really close quarters, they're not well paid, don't have resources to do their job. So the citizens become their, for lack of a better word, their punching bag. So citizens become people that you can oppress because you're in a position of power. And this is also situated in Nigeria's historical context, as most of our years since independence has been spent in military rule. So the whole notion of security agencies being oppressive and wielding power and not necessarily being friends with the citizens plays out very much so in the way our police relate to citizens. But I think globally, what this moment means is really about voice, with Black Lives Matter, and even within Nigeria, with the context of our Office of the Citizen campaign that we run around citizens understanding that whoever is in a role of authority in government works at your request, is there to serve you. So as a citizen, you have the power to basically hold them account. Within Nigeria's context, relatively novel, 20 years straight of a democracy. So the idea of electing people to serve you and then holding them accountable is quite a new concept. And we're learning and evolving in that space. So I think that if anything, I would say that's what really connects it. But, and I think for us as well, the interesting bit of a quote by Nelson Mandela, Nigeria is the largest Black nation. And Nelson had this to say, he said, "The world will not respect Africa until Nigeria earns that respect. The Black people of the world need Nigeria." And confidence. And so that the whole sort of next of conversation. Thanks, Ngozi.
Can you, sorry, I'm not sure if, I think the connection, can everyone hear me okay? Just confirming. If you can give me a thumbs up, if you can hear me.
Now we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I think that bit that you said was like very interesting, Yemi, in terms of like drawing the lines and connecting kind of like, well, first expressing what the difference was between here, but then you kind of brought it back, I think, to like oppression. And I think that kind of like ties the line between like the experience of Black people everywhere. There's this outside entity that is kind of wielding power. I think you all mentioned power in what you've talked about against us, against against Black people, and it oppresses them. So as we think about like kind of this moment and the uniqueness of this moment, in that almost everywhere well, not almost, actually every single place in the world, like everybody is focused on this issue of like Black people, injustice, and that there is clearly something wrong in how communities are policed, and how like the policies within communities that are affecting people. So if we can kind of talk about this moment, and I want to, Michael Eric Dyson said something like really interesting about a week ago, and he said that it's like currently, like right now, there's this global acknowledgement to match the current global pandemic, and it seems that there's this global explosion of consciousness. So really, it's like the first time that I can think of in my life that almost every city in America for sure was like on fire and focused on this. And you can just watch on the news or on the internet how every single city was like hyperly focused on what was happening now. So when you think about that, like how do we draw the line? Like what more can we do so that, I guess what I'm trying to say, that we're working kind of as a coalition, or like kind of in cohesion with one another. So it's not just like, oh, I can see, if I'm in Nigeria, I can see something happening in America and I'm like, wow, that's bad. And here's my situation in Nigeria and okay, that's bad. Like, what's the advantage of us kind of looking at each other and saying, well, if we're all experiencing this as Black people, like there needs to be something, there needs to be a way that we elevate it and talk about like, what are we gonna do as this global Black community that is experiencing the exact same thing. And the world currently is looking and saying, wow, something needs to be done. So if you can all maybe share, like, how can we like maybe leverage this global sentiment and build upon it? And we can start with, we'll start with Andre.
So yeah, you know what's interesting, I think there are some distinctions to be made between colonialism, apartheid, and white supremacy, but for most Black people, it generally looks the same, because many of the same practices that suppress the voices of Black people, I mean, really are borrowed from country to country, from town to town. So you can be in a Black majority place, but you still see the same types of white oppressive practices in those places. And so, but I actually think the answer to your question is actually happening now. There's been tremendous groundwork all across the world, particularly inspired by Black Lives Matter, the movement for Black Lives, and the Black Lives Matter movement in general. But the criminal justice issue is taking center stage. And now there are other issues related to that. But I think it's a great policy anchor to build upon. Clearly, we're advancing to issues of housing, education, healthcare, and all of those other injustices. But you'd be surprised of how neat a solution in America can help conditions in South Africa, can help conditions in Nigeria, because many of the assumptions under colonialism, apartheid, and white supremacy are essentially the same. There have been systems built to devalue and suppress Black voices, and it's occurred in all of those sectors. But the practices in criminal justice really look similar in very different contexts.
Nice. Let me unmute you first. Nomsa, kind of building on what like Andre just said, and the idea of like them being exactly the same thing, like white supremacy, colonialism, apartheid are all basically extensions of the same thing. And when you look at, you know, for South Africa, coming out of apartheid and everything that's happening now, like how do you, because during apartheid, that was like a moment where like everybody in the world, because it's probably like some people's most recent memory of like really seeing like white power in your face impacting a community of people. So like coming out of that, like what are some of maybe the learnings, or how do you see that we can build more global coalitions where people in South Africa are reaching out to maybe people in Nigeria, or reaching out to people in France, just to kind of build this coalition to kind of keep amplifying what's happening and keep pushing for this wider structural change?
So, you know, from my perspective and South Africa's perspective, and my experience as a Black woman living in South Africa, and the learnings that we've gotten from Funkitimwalking is that the role of the police has not really changed over time. So what the police were doing in apartheid, they're still doing it now. On top of that, it's kind of compounded with this, with what I would say is almost a lack of training. So people don't actually know what they're supposed to do at work. So one of the things that we struggle the most with is the fact that most police people that we engage with don't actually have an understanding of what they actually are at work to do. So their understanding or their knowledge of what police are supposed to do is what they're doing, but that's not what the role of the police in a democratic South Africa is supposed to look like. So that's one of the major things that we grappling with. How do you effect change there when there is that kind of culture in policing? So, a culture of intimidation, a culture of victimization, a culture of hiding wrongdoing by other police in the police station, a culture of just not doing your job as well, a culture of just going to work to get a paycheck. And so what we've looked at, and I presented to the president about a month ago, and one of the main things that I was saying there was the police really need to understand what their jobs are, and they need to be given targets, and they need to have performance indicators, and a measurable way that we can say, okay, the police are doing what they're supposed to be doing. And basically better performance management and reporting and review. Are the police doing what they're supposed to be doing and being reviewed by the community? Another thing that we've been doing a lot of is working with our community policing forums. So community policing forums is basically a neighborhood watch kind of thing. but mostly they work at like big events. But now it's about how do we work with the community policing forums in terms of everyday life. And what does this moment represent for me and for Funkitimwalking? I think it's a great opportunity for us to look at the different experiences that we're having around the world. And I think that the experience of Black people all over the world is the same. And I think we need to stop thinking borders, and we need to start thinking about what are the issues that are affecting us. I think technology has given us the capability to allocate resources even outside of where you are. It's possible for me to contribute resources to a community in Nigeria just because I understand that the struggle is the same. So for me, it's about how can we take this moment to create a better experience moving forward for Black people.
Thank you. So Monifa, a lot of what Nomsa says is directly tying into the work that Movement for Black Lives is doing around defunding the police. So maybe you can share some of that, but then also talk about how you're disseminating that information and that platform and that agenda for defunding the police, but you're doing it in cities around the world. It's just not in America.
Right. Well, first I wanted to just take one minute to step back and just to push back a little bit, because in this work that I've been doing for a long time, people who are abolitionists in our country have really pushed back on me, And I think if we actually sit for a minute and ask ourselves, why do we need police? Really? And then unpack that, this idea that there needs to be better police or better trained police or better paid police, it all starts to fall apart, When we look at what's happening in our community, and did the crime happen because there's an issue of poverty? Is there unstable housing? Is there lack of access to mental health treatment? Or is there community mediation that could have prevented the escalation to where this has gone? And not only do we find that those interventions are more effective, they're hugely less expensive, right? But we have all been kind of groomed in this idea, in an era that really just like Yemi rightfully said, came right out of slavery. This concept that communities need to be patrolled in a military manner firmly sits on how are we going to control freed slave populations, right? And even before that, how we capture people who run away from slavery. And so when we're really able to sit and ask members of our community, even people who have suffered from all kinds of violence, they've been robbed, they've been beat up, and ask them, what does safety look like to you? What does it feel like? It never involves a police officer. It always involves safe housing. It always involves access to food. And then we combine that with data we did that said, what exists in the safest communities in the United States? And they actually have drastically less police. Like just like and so then it puts to question, why do we think there is a role in safety? There's a role for police in safety. And of course, it's not something that can happen overnight, but it's a dream, it's a freedom dream that we have, that we think we can be on a path to. And I believe we could be on a path to it globally, you know, if we come together and kind of pull away at this idea that our members of our communities need to be policed. Any member needs to be policed. It's hard because we know we've experienced a lot of trauma. We've also been hit a lot with the propaganda of policing. Policing was huge. Popular before we were born. 50, 60 years ago, people hated police. They couldn't stand police. They were underpaid. You know, they were very similar, like everything that Yemi was describing. And so Hollywood put forth this propaganda machine. And so we got Law and Order, Hill Street Blues, Boys in Blue. Like we, Color of Change was an organization here, did a whole data review and just showed how this idea hammering in people's heads, one, that police are good, that they're necessary, that they're your homies, that they prevent bad things from happening, was really something that's created on the screen. And I mean, even stuff people like The Wire, you know, like all these shows kind of reinforce this idea that if we're gonna survive, we have to have somebody with a gun patrolling our families and our neighbors. So I'm not sure actually how we bring the conversation together globally. I think this is definitely one of the forums, and this is a start. But I also think that once COVID has passed, hopefully, we need to actually, you know, have convenings and go and really see how our different communities are working on this issue, and have these conversations that go beyond just like, how can we not be victims of police violence, but what does safety really look like and mean to African people?
Thank you. Yemi, I want to bring you in on this, because a lot of what Monifa stated, like the going to like the root of the problem and the fact that it's lack of social services, people don't have inadequate housing, food insecurity. There's so many issues that result in like the things that we see, and then policing becomes the solution, which is not the solution. It's addressing these social inequities in our community. And I think that's so real, like within Nigeria, right? There's so like the government is unwilling to provide any social services to the people, and you're really left to be on your own. And then you have the police there. So maybe talk about like the work you're doing around that, and kind of your learnings and some of the things that like people in other places kind of can gather from that, from the situation and like the dynamic within Nigeria.
Thank you. Thanks, Monifa. That was really helpful. You were talking and I was going, yep. For me, it's fascinating in a lot of ways. And I think it is, one big thing though, is the need for us to be very deliberate about education. And about anchoring our population with understanding our history and context. So a lot of the things that Monifa was talking about around the role of Hollywood, I mean, I didn't even know that part, but it as you're saying it made sense. And Hollywood has a track record of subtly changing our perception of what is right or wrong, just because we're bombarded with this so much over a period of time. And it's interesting that in Nigeria, we're actually paralleling that to what Nollywood could do in terms of changing behavior. Like, how can we use the movies and the arts to project a different, in this case, sort of positive messaging, but recognizing the power that movies and the arts generally have in shaping how people think. So one, I think it's just the very clear sense, and I think Monifa also made reference to that this is a marathon, but it's a marathon that we need to be consistent about. So she talked about from Ferguson to now, realizing that all the sort of attempts to reform and modify and sort of chip at the police in its existing state doesn't really do anything. That now it's the time to really unpack that and sort of decide this is what we want and this is what we need. And so it's the same thing, just realizing that the process to change how people understand issues, how people engage issues, is a long process, because this is what you were born into, this is what you understand, this is what you've seen, and it can't be left to one powerful motivational speech, one powerful preacher, one fantastic article that someone writes that suddenly that's it. But it must be consistent, the same way Hollywood consistently bombards your mind until what is abnormal becomes normal, just because you've seen it so often. You're like, oh, this looks good. It's the same way that we must sort of take on this work to change the way us as people of color see ourselves and relate to ourselves. I mean, Nomsa's point about the police is so apt. Around the police do what they do. Think just because that's what they know. This is how we know to be. This is what we get paid to do. And in our particular context, when you have a bankrupt political leadership who's even from our military days now use the police deliberately to oppress, that's how they're used. The police don't see themselves beyond that. And so to Monifa's point about what does security, what does safety look like, one of my favorite stories to tell is that of elections that we had probably 8 odd years ago. And polling, like a community polling unit, some grandmas were sitting down, they had food, and some young boys came in and they were going to cause trouble. And the grandmas literally got up and they were like, I don't know you, I don't know you. We know everybody in this neighborhood. So if you were registered to vote in this polling unit, we would know you. So you definitely don't belong here. So scat. Now, they didn't need police, they didn't need guns, they didn't need anything, but the boys bailed because the grandmas just were like, no, we're not having this here. And so again, to Monifa's point around what does safety and security look like, we didn't need guns, we didn't need men in blue or black, whatever colors they were in your country, to get them to go. And I think lastly, I just really want to make the point around, as we educate as well, understanding the need for us to just interrogate issues and stories. So it was this year, for example, that I realized Africa Day, that was celebrated, I think it was in May. It took me a while to realize that, wait a minute, the history of Africa Day was Africa Liberation Day. So it was significant in the name because it was a celebration of African nations gaining independence. Now, when you strip it of the word liberation, and you call it Africa Day and turn it into a, I don't know, 3-hour special on MTV Base, problems. So as I agree with Monifa that I'm not quite sure how this sort of global bit is, but conversations like this are extremely important. But just really the need to understand, educate, and for those with Monifa working on policy, that are already going along in parallel, but educate. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I wanted to say as well that also the role that security agencies, the police in this regard, play in countries like South Africa or Nigeria, where there's a lot of inequality. So your elite use the tools of the state to keep that. So that, as Ngozi said, you're not providing social services that people need, but you have a police that you, in a sense, empower to oppress. The police themselves are oppressed, but then they get paid to oppress other people, so they do that with joy. So, yeah.
Thank you. So, Andre, kind of building on what two things that Yemi mentioned. One is the idea, the importance of like education. She kept saying educate, and like what, like in your book and like in your work, you're kind of like educating people on like knowing your value and the fact that we how our communities and everybody in everything that they're saying is talking about the devaluing of Black people and Black bodies, and that's why all this is happening. So if you can speak specifically about kind of that re-education or kind of recalibration as we look at like the value of Black people and the assets within our communities, because I think it's applicable regardless of where you are.
Yeah, what's interesting, when I talk about education in the book, I often say, and you'll hear me say this, that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. So the education that I'm really pointing to oftentimes falls in the laps of white people, and the data that I present often just validates the concerns of Black communities. And so I'll just give you an example. I looked at home prices in Black majority neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%, and I compared those to housing prices where the share of the population was less than 1%. And I controlled for all those factors that people say cause lower home values. I controlled for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics you find. And what I found that equivalent homes in equivalent social circumstances are priced 23% lower, about 48,000 per home. Accumulatively, that's 156 billion in what amounts to lost equity. That equity we know is used by, and at least in the States, for people to start businesses. In fact, that money would have started more than 4 million businesses based on the average startup that Blacks use to start businesses. It would have funded more than 8 million four-year degrees based on the average cost of a four-year public education. It would have replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan. For those abroad, Flint, Michigan had a poisoning of the water. It would have replaced the pipes there 3,000 times over. It's a big number. And the reason why I say that's money that's extracted from communities simply just for being Black. And the same is true for policing. We've essentially created a jobs program that extracts wealth from people. So, you know, if you invest in a teacher, that investment amplifies because you're creating a middle-class job generally, and that person is then teaching others to in ways that advance their human capital. When you invest in a police officer, guess what they're doing? They're, in some cases, literally taking people out of the economy, fining them and charging them fees. So you mitigate any kind of gains from that. So, you know, I know I'm talking economically for largely a moral issue, but this is important. We need to invest in things that's going to help us grow. And I think that's what I found the most powerful thing about the defund the police movement, because for centuries, we've been investing in things that protect whiteness. And we've got to shift those funds in ways that benefits Black communities and benefits Black people. One other thing around this, there's arguments around quality policing. What do we need? Now, clearly, the officer that killed Derek Chauvin, that killed George Floyd, he needs to be jailed. He needs to be prosecuted. With that said, you know, if we would have had the systems in place where people had power, that would have never happened. It would have never happened. And so we need a strategy to slowly, quickly defund the police. And then, but we also need to build in systems that will prevent those kind of things from happening. And Monifa is absolutely right. You don't see police in classy, highbrow neighborhoods. You don't. They're not to be seen. And it maximizes the activity in that place. And so, yeah, you know, I believe Derek Chauvin should be in jail. I do. But we would have so fewer incidents like that if Black people had adequate housing, adequate transportation, adequate pay. And I'll just throw this in there. I do think we have an opportunity because of COVID. Ironically, this is forcing us to look at our budgets in the United States. States and cities have to now prioritize. And in that prioritization, they really do have to find ways to increase jobs, to increase economic activity. Investments in police don't do that. So we have leverage now, not only from the movement, but from the economic conditions of cities. And so now's the time to really drive this home. If you really want to build up communities, you got to get rid of the impediments to that growth. And housing discrimination is there, job discrimination is there, but also police are there. So yeah, so this is a complicated issue. But I want to say, when I talk about education, is really to say, hey, here's the actual number. What I always say, that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can solve. That we're not the ones that need education. And in so many ways, Black people have known about the police problem for since slavery, right? But now we're seeing power shifts in ways that are elevating the issue, where we're having a political movement around it. And so and I say this, I really do believe that. I'm close to 50 years old. I've never seen the kind of enthusiasm, commitment, organization. I mean, and you know, I was born right after the Civil Rights Movement. There's nothing like this. And so I have to be encouraged in a lot of ways. I mean, this is taken on a global level of significance. And so I'm encouraged at this point. So keep pushing wherever you are. Keep pushing, because the winds at our back at this point, and we've got to keep moving, and nothing has shifted. Nothing in the United States or elsewhere has shifted without protest. Keep that, and this is another important thing. I hate when people disconnect social justice from economic justice. There's nothing that like the saying that a person doesn't belong in an economy like a police officer killing a person right dead in broad daylight. Nothing that said that they don't belong in an economy. Police are protecting and serving supposedly a community. It's just that Black people aren't considered members of the community because they're considered threats. And so much of this is about our second-class citizenship and the status, and police represents that. And so if we want to be full members of society, full citizens, you need to get rid of those things that signify and say that you're not a second class, you're not a citizen. So, you know, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but we got momentum. Things are good. Things are happening, and I'm encouraged by it all.
Cool. So I think like you got us on track to like kind of talking about moving kind of beyond the moment, going from a moment, how you said protest is necessary, to the movement, and then like, okay, now what's the action? What's the policy piece? What's going to happen? And so I think and there are many ways to approach it. I think sometimes people get stuck in there's only one way, like we're going to strictly focus on doing this particular thing or changing this policy, when there's so much that needs to happen, and there's so many tools we have, and there's so many roles as Black people that we can play. And that kind of gets to like the community action piece, and kind of one of the reasons why we're gathering here. Like, what can we all be doing like right now, like when this momentum is here? So I want to go to Nomsa to kind of talk about, as we close out, and talk about what's next and like calls to action, because you're taking something that seems like maybe trivial or small and saying like, I want people walking. Funkitimwalking, we're going to get in the streets and walk. But that's so powerful, the idea of people saying, I want to be in control of my own life. We control these streets, not you, not the police, and we will be out here walking. So that's like something so simple, but it is at the same time revolutionary. So can you talk about that as like one of the solutions and one of the things that you're doing in this moment, and then we'll have everybody kind of talk about like calls to action and some solutions.
Thanks, Ngozi. Okay, so I want to say, Monifa, it's you know what you said there. It took me back, and I started to think, because in America you've been saying defund the police, and for me in my context, I've been struggling to make the connection, because my experience with the police, I'm still in a paradigm where it's like, what's a world without police? And then, you know, as Andre was speaking, I was thinking about Funkitimwalking, and Funkitimwalking is really that. So at the moment in South Africa, Funkitimwalking is focused in Soweto. And Soweto is a Black township. Poverty, inequality is basically built as a dormitory for Johannesburg. So that's where all the Black people go to sleep, because the white people didn't want the Black people around them, but they still needed the Black people as the petrol to run the engine of Johannesburg. And so that's how it was built. And so it's got all the issues: poverty, crime, drug abuse. And these are some of the things and the reasons why we can't walk. And even Soweto, the way that it's built, it's not built for pedestrians. It's not built for you to enjoy walking. You know, the way that the actual way that it's built it's kind of like a built environment that must belittle you and make you feel the experience is violence of walking. And so Funkitimwalking is really about how do we create spaces or celebrate spaces and support things that the government has done that are of benefit to Black people. So the government over the last 25 years, you know, has built theaters, put bicycle lanes, put parks in Soweto. And so I'm taking that and I'm using that as an advantage to get people walking more. And my thinking around, if more people are walking, the more people that there are walking in the streets, the safer it is. But walking out of leisure, not walking out of necessity. Because people do walk out of necessity. But we want people to walk out of leisure, it's an option to walk. Another thing, and I liked what you said, Andre, about property prices. For me, if I can get Soweto to be a place where a woman can walk at any time of day, in any condition, I've now changed the quality of life in Soweto, which will have a positive impact on property prices. And I do see property prices as a really important source of equity for Black people in South Africa, because most of the property in Soweto is owned by Black people. So it's not a fight that we have to have where we are taking land, even though that fight must still happen. We still want the land, but you know, so Funkitimwalking is really about that. And it's about keeping the currency in Soweto, because, you know, Soweto being this dormitory where people want to go to sleep, you know, we make money in Johannesburg and then we take the money and we go and spend it in the city. So it's just multiplying in the city. So people are benefiting outside of Soweto. So, you know, a walking rand is a local rand, and it's about getting people to spend more money locally. So Funkitimwalking, even though it's based on making people walk, I really do see it as a way in which I can drastically change the experience of Black people and create access to opportunity for the community that I live in.
Thank you. So Yemi, we will go to you to kind of talk about, like, what are some things, I mean, your EIE there's so many issues that that you approach, and you're constantly like trying to open these conversations with government and policymakers and kind of create an environment that allows for dialogue, but also allows for action. What are some things, if you were to like say a call to action or like a particular project or anything that you're kind of working on that can resonate with anybody, anywhere, that they can maybe put into practice? Can you kind of share some of your work that you're doing that might relate to that?
I think the easiest one that could translate is our campaign called Office of the Citizen that I mentioned earlier. And really at the heart of that is, again, the two bits of what I spoke about. One, educating. I mean, Andre talked about the fact that Black people know about policing. Yeah, you might know that police people are bad and brutal, but I mean, the context there or the history there, maybe not as much. And I think, well, that's why what I find for me is a bit of the nuance and really understanding what that is, and which ties to what Monifa is saying around what do police do? Why do we need them? And Nomsa's point around a world that she can't imagine without police. And I definitely can imagine life without police. I grew up on a campus, a university campus in Nigeria. We had police, but we never saw them. I mean, they were just kind of there. I don't even know. To be honest, as I'm talking, I'm trying to remember like where they would be. but they weren't in your face because, again, it was a university campus, so there was really there was no need for a system to keep people contained or keep people within certain confines. So Office of the Citizen really focuses on within Nigeria's context, and I think even in the US at this point, really, if one looks at, for example, the upcoming elections, even if all of this, in addition to the policy and all the bits that we're trying to do, what do the elections represent? And everything from getting people out to get registered to vote, getting people out to actually vote on election day, and what that means in terms of choices, and what that choice as a vote is actually, what is that saying? I mean, one of my very good friends jokes around past, the West has had the kind of like on the continent, and about our dictators and our corrupt leaders and our crazy heads of state. So now we are offering our funders insights from their grantees on the continent about how to deal with a crazy head of state. So we can offer you a world of experience on when you have a head of state that's lost his marbles. So the dynamics is really very interesting, but the elections are really extremely important in my view. So maybe those two things I'd say. So Office of the Citizen, which really focuses on citizens owning their voice and realizing that anybody who's in an elected position or who's an appointed position in government is there to serve, and there's a duty to hold them accountable. Our history makes that particularly challenging. As I said, 20 years of democracy, not really understanding this whole concept of government of the people, by the people, for the people, and also having two other elements that are added to ours in this context: religion and culture. So I'm Yoruba by ethnicity, and for any of Nigeria's major ethnic groups, respect for elders is key. So if you have political leaders who are old enough to be your dads and old enough to be your uncle, mode of engagement and asking them about money they spent or stole, or how they're using their power, quote unquote, gets a bit difficult to have those conversations because of those cultural dynamics. Respect, I've gotten quite a few names because I really don't care. And then you have religion, where we've outsourced responsibility for the country that we have to a God who will fix it. So we're very religious, very different from faith, but extremely religious. So we pray a lot, Muslims and Christians, and pray to a God that will solve problems, will make things okay. And so in that, so the psyche of that for us is a big thing in terms of unpacking and letting citizens own their voice and realize that they're in a position of power to demand that government is accountable. And we've seen sort of the light bulb moments when citizens realize that, oh, I can call my legislator. That's quite novel. I mean, for example, EIE has built the only website now that makes it easy to find who represents you in our equivalent of Congress, National Assembly, based on numbers on your voter's card. So for those of you in the US, that's pretty basic. For us here, it's quite novel to be able to pick up the phone and call your senator and have a conversation without having your senator scream at you, asking you, who gave you my number? Why are you calling me? What do you want? Like, calm down, dude. Relax. It's not that serious. But so Office of the Citizen is one bit, and then elections the other bit. And I guess that's also a parallel for the US in really getting people to participate in that process. We had elections last year. I think we had 30-something% voter turnout, which is ridiculous. But it's an opportunity that, yes, candidates might not necessarily be the ideal, but it's also an opportunity to use your voice against. So yes, we might ideally be to vote for who you want, but it's also sometimes just as important to vote against who you don't want, to make that point as well.
So Monifa, we'll go to you to kind of like quickly share. I know you have to hop off. Like, what in terms of calls to action, because there's a lot that Movement for Black Lives is working on. So what in terms of like calls to action, or like what can we be doing in this moment, something that is very easy for like the community to begin to adopt? Oh, sorry.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I think that we need to flank each other's movements, right? Because our targets are different, you know, and it's really the infrastructure is still not there for people internationally to influence the decision makers in their local areas. But we can flank you and you can flank us. And so maybe what we can do as a next conversation is figure out, you know, how do we shore up the letters and the messages that Yemi is talking about that people are sending to their representatives saying, we echo this and we support and we flank as part of this global movement for Black lives, you know, and then also the other way around, and then continue to have these conversations because it's so complicated. I mean, you think about the hundreds and dismantle that. But just like Andre said, you know, there's nothing about nothing wrong with Black people that dismantling white supremacy can't solve. So as long as we have that same general goal in mind, I think we can actually move faster and move more powerful. A call to action for us for M4BL is to flank, you know, to uplift. I shared 2 links in the chat room, both the Movement for Black Lives website, where you can sign up, you can get the texts that we get and amplify stuff on social media or share with your communities. Also amplifying the Breathe Act. We should maybe discuss offline. Maybe we can get letters of support. We can send in letters of support and we can get letters of support. One of the reasons why I have to jump off is because we have a meeting with the senator to talk about the bill, because now people are like, defund the police. Oh, y'all are serious. Oh, y'all not leaving the streets. Oh, the celebrities support you. Oh, it's 150 organizations. So let's talk. But to show that there's international global support is helpful too. So definitely, you know, sign up for our emails is a huge support, and then making sure that we follow up and stay in touch. I also want to point out that I know that you all around the globe experience this all the time. We've had a huge peak in attacks on activists and protesters. In fact, last night right here in New York, a SUV just ran into people marching on 42nd Street. Then a few nights ago on Seattle, where BLM protesters shut down a highway, a car got on the exit ramp and ran them over and actually killed one of the activists. And so I just want to send just a lot of love and light and solidarity to everyone globally that is doing this work. And, you know, when we say we're putting our bodies on the line, that is literal. We are literally putting our bodies on the line so that in the next 50 years, I'm also almost approaching 50, our children won't have to witness a George Floyd or be a George Floyd, you know? And so that's what's happening in the face of COVID. And we're strong because we see all of that activism out of the continent. You know, we study the history of South Africa. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we've had deep political education sessions within our movement, looking and dissecting that movement in South Africa and figuring out the interventions that would work or that would or just inspire a new version of it. So this is really great. The call to action is really for us to be in community, but if you can uplift our bill and our campaigns, that's good as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. I'm looking at some of the questions we have, and I think for the most part, they have been answered. If anyone has any other questions, I'm looking really quickly, please drop them in the comments right now. Otherwise, I think we might be good to go. Thank you so much, y'all. We went a bit over time, but it was great. I definitely appreciate this conversation. We're going to transcribe this talk. That way we can share it more widely with more people and keep the conversation going. I thank you all for joining us. Andre, Monifa, Yemi, Nomsa, thank you so much for joining us and setting the tone for the second part of our afternoon, where we'll be talking with some people in roundtables and kind of using some of what you've all shared as kind of inspiration for what we're going to discuss. So thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, we'll be moving on to the next part of the program. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very
Take
much.
care.
Thanks for having us. Bye,
Thanks,
Andre.
Ngozi.
Bye, Nomsa. Thank
Bye-bye,
you.
Yemi.
Bye.
Nomsa.
Awesome. So everyone who's still on, please hang on. Do not go anywhere. We are going to go into our community roundtables for those that are who are still with us. And this part is when we really begin to do some of the work and take some of the insights and the strategies that were just provided for us, and we kind of break them down into smaller groups. So that's what we'll be doing next. So everybody has their action steps. I'm just gonna go in alphabetical order and ask people to share. So we will start with Black Liberation Collective. Nick, if you can kind of share what were some of your learnings and then the 5 action steps you settled on.
Yeah, yeah, we had an awesome discussion. Those 5 of us. So we talked about ways in which we could reimagine safety, not just thinking about police and prisons, but just thinking about like what does safety look like for our communities actually. Um, so there were points that were made about like we wanted to see, you know, demilitarization of police departments, transparency to the community. We talked about what justice actually looks like for us. We talked about like how land was stolen. Like there's many things that could be talked about, right? In relation to how Black people have been impacted. So we talked about also what solidarity looks like globally, how we can show up for each other. There was somebody from Africa Next that talked about how land was stolen. And we also brought up the point about how Israel has stolen land from Palestinian people, a lot of which are Black people, and they're experiencing police violence as well over there. So how do we all show up for each other around the globe? We also talked about how access to housing, food, and healthcare are the leading causes of violence in our communities, not the lack of police. It's the lack of those things. And we also talked about how we can treat each other better as people in regard to harm. So our action steps, we came up with 6 of them actually.
Okay.
The first one was thinking about how we could educate our communities about alternatives to police. Like when we're thinking about divesting from police and police abolition, we want to think about what are ways that we can engage with our communities about what safety looks like outside of police, because our communities have internalized, me personally, I've internalized that it's impossible to live in a world where we're safe without the presence of police, when we found out that that's not true. So how do we engage with our community? Somebody mentioned the other action step was talking about how we can demand that layers are put in place to prevent the use of force, so that we're not constantly coming back to this same conversation about what do we do about the police officer that killed this Black person this time. Like we're not trying to go down this long road to an eventual world where Black folks are no longer killed, and that road consists of Black blood and Black bodies. So we want to figure out what are ways that we can prevent these things from happening. We also talked about demanding transparency and the community review board. That's something that's actually real. It's something that has been done in places all around the world where people from the community actually get to lead the investigations on police misconduct. and they actually have the power to fire a police chief and indict an officer. So that's the shifting of power from the hands of decision makers and lawmakers back into the hands of where the power belongs, which is with the people. That was another thing we talked about, advocating for demilitarization of police departments. They don't need tear gas canisters. They don't need rubber bullets. They don't need these batons. They don't need tanks. They don't need ATVs. They don't need all these things. These are all things that we are spending money on. Us tax-paying people spending money on that does not go into the actual things that we need that actually keep us safe and that actually it cares for our well-being. And lastly, we talked about demanding to divest from police and invest into the social conditions that cause us to believe that we need police. That's back to the housing, the food, the healthcare, the education, all these things. The lack of these things are the reason for crime. I'm wearing a hat right now that says FTP. A lot of people read that maybe as fuck the police. Or I think that me personally, I have a double meaning of it that says F the police, which is like, get rid of the police, yes, as well as feed the people. Because I believe that once that happens, once we actually take funds from the police departments, that we could also use those funds to invest into the people and their well-being. So those were our 5 action steps. I really appreciated the conversation and thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we will go next to Shabaka from Crossroads, Trinidad, Tobago.
Okay, yeah, we really problematized white supremacy in our discussion, and in that respect, we acknowledged our Africanness on both sides of the Atlantic, not just blackness as which is a political kind of social distinction, which can include anyone who is outside of the sort of preferred or privileged group in a society. And sometimes in history, even white people have suffered from blackness. In the case of the Jews in World War II as an extreme example. And so we really, we talked both from the perspective of blacks and from the perspective of African people on different sides of the Atlantic. We found the following issues. First, we thought it was important to collect data, to analyze that data, and to make that data known. We thought it was really important, particularly in countries that have black majority populations like Nigeria and Trinidad, which is where most of our group came from, that we bring these issues to the fore. After we do the research, we collect the data, and we analyze the data, and we bring this information to the fore, because there's a tendency to believe that you know, white supremacy doesn't operate in places where the majority is black or African in particular, and so we thought that was very important. The second thing, of course, demilitarizing the police, and we had an opportunity to talk about how that militarized force operates both in the Caribbean and on the continent of Africa. And you know, we were able to point out that in a country like ours, this most southerly isle of the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, which has such a limited budget, our police force looks exactly like the police force in New York or Chicago or any of the cities in the United States of America. They are as armed and as ready for war as any of those departments. So we acknowledge that. Nigeria, a bit different, but still similarities. We talked about changing police culture, and we wanted to put a specific emphasis on neutralizing white supremacy in that context. And of course, we had to then look at the wider society, because post-colonial societies definitely have what Frantz Fanon called germs of rot. What Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about when he talks about empires of the mind. These germs of rot that live in our minds and the way we perceive things with white over brown over black. And that has a huge part to play in the way we observed in our group that police treat certain people in our societies differently to the way they treat others. And we gave an example of Grenada over the last 2 weeks, and I advise everybody to go and find out what happened in Grenada that caused recent protests in that little Caribbean island, and you would see what I'm talking about. We also talked about the criteria to become a police officer. We felt that we needed to invest some time in developing aspects of the police education program that we thought were important for the communities, and that's something that we would have to develop. About investing in alternatives, typically called defunding the police. I think that was a huge part of our conversation, reallocating money that would go into the police forces in arming and gearing the police up into other aspects of other things that could create opportunities and development in our communities. And last but not least, we focused on the question of oversight institutions. And in Nigeria and on the continent of Africa and in the Caribbean, we find that the institutions that are responsible for overseeing police conduct tend to be very, very weak, under-resourced, underfunded, and without the necessary legislation.
I think Shabaka is having internet issues. Let's see.
The work that they're supposed to do. And of course, I want to take on board theory. Guys, I'm not, well, that was.
I think we completely lost him. Okay. All right. So Funeka, I think we'll see if Shabaka comes back on. But for now, Funeka, we'll go to you.
Okay, so we spoke about the purpose of police. Like many other people have mentioned, how it's hard to imagine a world without police, and it's important to look at historically what they were created for, in terms of slavery, or rather Jim Crow era in Jim Crow era in the States, as well as the colonialism in the African continent. And also we spoke a little bit about how the way in which American culture is exported all over the world through media, popular culture, that along with that, we need to be critical also of the ideas of how Black people are viewed are also exported all over the world. In the same vein as popular culture is exported to the rest of the world. So we're just looking at how Black people are depicted, how Black people are treated, and how the violence that exists in the States and in terms of relations with Black people is in a very sinister way is part of the export to other areas of the world. But not to say that yeah, but I won't go into that. We also spoke about the fact that in a majority Black country like ours, South Africa and Nigeria and so forth, the difficulties of speaking about anti-Blackness and race explicitly. I know in South Africa it's something that's not that people tiptoe around and don't actually want to name as such. We'd rather speak about class, we'd rather speak about poverty, poor areas, rural areas, township areas. All these areas are areas that are inhabited by Black people. The areas where police are deployed mostly are areas with Black people. We also spoke about the ideology, especially in South Africa, of reconciliation. Not just in South Africa, but in general when it comes to Black people and wrongs or the violence that they've experienced, whether it's slavery, colonialism, apartheid, this idea of reconciliation and moving on. And in South Africa, we can see in terms of the continued inequalities that part of that moving on means leaving the economy, leaving wealth in the hands of white people as it is right now. This is why we have inequality. This is why we have poor Black communities. It's directly as a result of having so-called political transition without addressing the economic issues such as land and wealth that still is in minority, which is white people's hands. We also spoke about the impunity that police have. Nigeria, Switzerland, and we also spoke about how the system, of course, is broken as a whole, and how the ultimate goal is to abolish police, prison systems, all these punitive measures, basically, and not just policing, looking at, for instance, the school to prison pipeline, and just how all these systems are very violent towards Black lives. And their existence is not to serve and not to protect and create safe environments for Black people. We also spoke about how a lot of the time police are there to protect elites. And so even in majority African countries like ours, the police are Black like us, but in most cases, they protect elites, whether it's political elites, whether it's white elites, but in general, they are antagonists towards poor people. So there is definitely an intersection between race and class, but the one should not be valued over the other. There should still be important discussions on race in the continent, and especially in countries such as South Africa. And so some of the action steps we spoke about are awareness raising in communities, as well as acknowledgement of race and privilege by white allies in our communities. We spoke about accountability. A lot of communities, especially poor communities, don't have the opportunity to hold police accountable. So having some form of community monitoring system ensures that people will have more, will be able to get justice whenever they are violated by police. So accountability is one of the important things that we noted and said that in order to have that, we need to have systems, legal reform, as well as community-based systems which monitor police, as well as protect the rights of the communities, and also a way in which to redress some of the injustices that they faced. And also we spoke a bit on redirecting funds, and basically during the lockdown period, about 5 billion rands was used. I'm not sure what the equivalent in other currencies is, but was used in the deployment of police. And so a lot of those funds could have been used for healthcare system, for the education system. There's many other issues that affect Black communities, and these funds can definitely be diverted towards that. It's not been effective having this many police or this much police presence. And in general, it's just been quite violent. And then also, one of the things we were discussing was addressing the role of the media, rather that a lot of this is also an ideological battle. So for instance, a lot of the stuff we spoke about Hollywood and the influence of Hollywood and the depictions of Black people in terms of that industry, but also media. For instance, in South Africa, before the Marikana massacre was known as the Marikana massacre, there was a journalist who did a study on how this was documented in mainstream media. And so one of the things that was found was a lot of people were in a disagreement that it was a massacre to begin with. Media was siding with police, with Lonmin Mine, was siding and basically depicting the miners as antagonistic in nature. And it took quite some time before media started viewing, rather seeing that it was a massacre. So media is quite important. So we were thinking of developing a media guideline, both in terms of across the globe, whether it's in the depictions of the likes of George Floyd, of Trayvon Martin, Black people in general, and how they are depicted in media and how these cases become reported is quite important. And so a guideline of sorts in order to guide how these incidents are reported. And I think another important point that we raised, which was not necessarily an action step, but just look at the intersectionality of all these issues, especially in terms of Black Lives Movement. We're looking at also mentioning the fact that it's important to raise issues of Black trans lives which have been affected, Black queer lives, Black women, and in South Africa in particular, looking at other African nationals from and migrants and refugees and how they're treated in the country. As I stated previously, a lot of this anti-Blackness is internalized and manifests in quite many ways: femicide, xenophobia, Afrophobia. And so I think as an overarching thing, it's a goal to ensure that all these steps take into account, where we make sure we acknowledge all these different positionalities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So we will go next to international alerts. Is Kenneth? I don't know if Kenneth is still on. Yes. Okay. Great. Hi, Kenneth.
Yes. Hi, Gumi. So our conversation didn't go across the Atlantic much because we had Nigerians and South Africans in the room. And beyond the white South Africans versus the Black South Africans scenario with colonization apartheid, we had similarities across board as far as societies were concerned. Now, there are colonialists who use police for as a regimist tool to oppress Blacks, but with the removal of colonialism, you still got that oppression that's happening by the haves on the have-nots. So now you have an inequality gap where the have-nots are now the ones who are being oppressed by the haves, using the police as a tool. So we look at scenarios of social and gender-based violence, femicide, and LGBTQs in both countries, especially through COVID, where we've had, for a period, we had fatalities from police violence, the numbers of fatalities being more than the number of fatalities from COVID itself. And then there's that question whether the police should exist in the first place, whether it hasn't run its full course and needs to cease to exist. And so perhaps it's the time for non-state actors to come into that space and begin to provide policing solutions. So we look at such things as educating the public. There is a need for the general population to understand first what their rights are, and then what the law provides for the police to operate within societies. So we need to know where the limits are. Again, you have such repressive laws that provide for police to arrest people without a warrant, for example, in Nigeria, and then to also detain you if they so wish. So there's a need for the public to know where their rights start and stop, and also the limits to which the police can treat them. So we look at what has worked, what we are not doing right, and what needs to be replicated in other places. Then we looked at policy. If at all, the police needs to be there for a short to mid-term before it becomes obvious that we need to phase them out. What are the policy changes that are needed to ensure that the police truly becomes a service that meets the needs of the people? There's a concern for the kinds of people who get recruited into the police. So the recruitment policy for the police needs to change. We need to begin to recruit people with better education, with better enlightenment to join the police. Continuing to recruit people only because they do not have jobs and the police becomes a last resort only creates a system where thugs are now armed by the state and can be used. Then the duration. You find people who are trained for 6 months, which is indeed a very short time if you're going to consider gender mainstreaming, conflict sensitivity, crowd control. Policing 6 months is usually a very limited period to train anyone to now be armed with a gun and live ammunition to go into the community. Then again, looking at the welfare of police, they are humans as well. The state needs to begin to treat them as humans. If the police are dehumanized, they would in turn want to dehumanize the people because everyone is in search for power. Then we need to create systems, safe spaces for police public relations. People need to be able to air their grievances. There are instances where the third-party system where people can report police atrocities and seek redress is not working in South Africa, neither in Nigeria. So there needs to be that platform where people can have deliberate conversations with the police, and then perhaps a new modus operandi can be agreed on how the police needs to work and how the people will then begin to perceive the police. Because again, sometimes how people perceive the police now becomes a means for the police to oppress them. We also looked at how we can monitor the police. This might sound really difficult. How can we surveil the surveiller? But this is basically about how we can put stop gaps, checks and balances to be able to tell the police when they have stepped beyond the limits of what the law provides them to provide citizens with service. There was a mention about Canada's monitoring and evaluation system for policing that works, which could be a good case practice that can't be replicated in other places. But then, if we're going to be holding the police accountable, this also means that one, we need to begin to bring in digital systems into monitoring police, because again, this provides room for many people to connect to situations and also for validation. And then perhaps we also need to begin to look at peer review mechanisms where police from one country can look at what's working in another country or what's not working, and provide valid and honest feedback where the police in a country and the people can then look at that feedback and then look it back to the police public relations to say, okay, we are having this feedback for social cohesion. Where are the gaps that the police need to fill? What are the gaps that the people need to fill? And then find ways where the relationship can be seamless, and indeed it can truly be community policing. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. And then we have Social Justice Bermuda. Was it? I'm not sure if Kristen was. Oh,
Yeah, it's Kristen that's here.
oh okay.
Hi. So yeah, it was a great conversation, and like everyone else, I just sort of echo the how rich the dialogue was, and how interesting it was to really compare and contrast our regions that are completely different sizes, have different histories, have different economy structures, all of that. But a lot of the issues are the same. So from Bermuda's perspective, we're still a British colony, so a huge part of what we're pushing for is self-determination and independence as well. And that's along this whole conversation of abolishing these oppressive systems, because we are still paying to have a governor here, so things like that. So yeah, a lot of what everyone else talked about, we talked about, so I'll probably be pretty quick in terms of just saying how we got to where our main 5 action points were. But they were a lot around looking at what other organizations are doing, whether in the United States or around the world, seeing what they're doing and how we can localize it. And that's been really huge for us in Bermuda, because we don't have the situations of, extreme police violence that are occurring in other parts of the world. So when we wanted to create a sort of local Black Lives Matter chapter, that was the pushback that we got, or the feedback that we got. And so that's something that we would say to every organization, and that's what we started. That's what we started with. So that's the first action item, is really extrapolating the Black Lives Matter data initiatives to localize it to our own regions. And I think that that's really key, especially around the conversation about defunding the police, because the 8 to Abolition website, 8toabolition.com, they've got those 8 steps for how they want to move America to a place without police and without prisons. So there, the conversation about divesting from police and investing in, community care, healthcare, schools, housing, that's a key part of it. And so I think when we say defund the police without that other space, without, explaining that other part of it, I think that's where we lose people. So really looking at their entire platform and seeing, okay, this fits my region, this one doesn't necessarily make as much sense, this one, etc. So that then when we are able to speak to Black Lives Matter, we can do it from a local perspective. And so, for example, the data that Monifa said in the panel, I think she dropped it in the chat, where she was saying, that $6 billion is spent on the NYPD budget, which is greater than they spend on healthcare, housing, and education combined. What is that statistic for our region? What is that, what is that data in our space, so that we can speak intelligently to it from a local, regional perspective? So that was the first thing. And then, and in that same space, the next action would be really sharing this information widely, so we start to shift the language around reimagining safety. So we talked about the shift in our language around the pandemic, how these were the terms that were widely used in the medical community are now widely used in the general community because of the pandemic. And we need to do the same thing for abolition, to start talking about it and normalizing the language and bringing people along with us in that conversation. So we're putting it in our art. We had a number of artists in the group, photographer and radio host, so using it as part of our conversations, as part of our social media, so that we're able to really educate people as we bring them along, and as I said, normalize the language, so that when hopefully in another bit of time, when someone says defund the police, people know what that means. We're not talking about the police disappearing tomorrow. We're talking about a series of steps that are divestment and investment and all of these things that make a world without police possible, that make it unnecessary to have the current policing system that we have, because we remove all of the systems that are in place that create crime. So that was our other action around shifting language. And then in sort of a shorter term, or in terms of immediate actions, it was a great suggestion, which is also a part of the 8 to Abolition platform, is around reviewing calling for a review of penal laws. And so whether that's your organization doing it yourself or you as part of a community group or whatever, but really looking at how people are criminalized and looking at all of the laws. You know, in Bermuda, we're in the middle of a reform around marijuana. And that's a really important, you know, drug laws that criminalize people instead of looking at it as a public health issue, you know, or especially if it's not an addictive issue, if it's sort of just leisurely use and they're being criminalized. That's a huge part of why people are locked up in Bermuda. So looking at laws like that are criminalizing activity that doesn't need to, that could be a fine or could be, you know, not an arrest or something that's on someone's record that they then have forever. So really calling for a review of these laws because they disproportionately impact Black people. We're over-policed, and so these laws that, you know, criminalize very minor activities are going to disproportionately negatively impact Black people. So that could be a project that you lobby for that needs to be done by, you know, the legal fraternity of your region, or it's something that maybe your community group undertakes, that you're going to sort of go through the laws of your land and start to educate people about what needs to be changed. And that was the next action item, is around that education and really doing it. Doesn't have to be formal, heavy courses, but taking on the role of educating people about the law, how laws are made, how they can advocate for themselves, and just teaching them about, you know, how politics work, you know, at every level of government, how they're elected, and thus then that reinforces why voting matters as well. And then in terms of the other part of teaching people about the law, we looked at really teaching people about history and doing, you know, teaching people about the history and the impact that Black people have had globally as a way to give us as Black people a wider knowledge of self, but also, you know, for the wider world to start to I guess, value our lives more and to value the impact that Black people have brought to the world. It's a sad thing that we even have to have this conversation about, you know, Black history or teaching people, you know, that's one of the things around having to yell out and convince people that our lives matter that feels really strange to me. But it's necessary, and maybe history and is a part of it. I know in Bermuda, we were, you know, a big part of the Black Power movement in the Caribbean. You know, America had the Black Panthers, we had the Black Beret Cadre, we hosted the first International Black Power Congress, and so many Bermudians have no idea about it at all. And so not understanding those moments of pride as Black people, those moments of contribution also lends to Black people not valuing Black lives. And I think, you know, that's a part of the sort of conversation about how the education system also helps to prop up these systems of racism by not letting our young people and us know about the magic that we are, the power and strength that we are. So really integrating that first, maybe on a more informal basis. You know, we're doing community conversations, maybe ones about history, but then really lobbying for those changes to the curriculum to be made so that on the longer term, all people of your country and your region understand more about the history of the place and the impact of Black people. So those were our 5.
Nice. Thank you so much. This was really great. I think what our hopes were in organizing this feel fulfilled, at least to me. I mean, the idea was that we were witnessing, I'm currently here in the US, in New York City to be specific, and just witnessing everything that was happening here and then talking to people, you know, back home in Nigeria, friends in South Africa, and hearing these stories, right? Because you mentioned like COVID, and I think Kenneth also mentioned like the impact of that, and hearing these stories, like people are literally being killed in the streets because they are outside during COVID, and you're saying they're supposed to be protected, but the police are not serving as protectors. They're actually killing people during a pandemic, and you're having more people in African countries dying from police violence during a pandemic than the actual pandemic. So just kind of hearing all these stories and just coming to the realization that there's something that is happening around the world that's impacting us all, but yet there are different approaches. And hearing what everybody's saying, like our situations are not identical, so we can't just like carbon copy, cookie cutter put something like say, okay, this is working in Nigeria, let's do that in Bermuda. So obviously we have to adapt, but I think this is a good start, having people like listening and hearing other people's perspectives, hearing what's working in certain countries and what's not working, you know, in other countries and communities. So I'm really happy we had this conversation. Just from the feedback we've gotten already, it seems that it has been impactful in terms of like what happens next, because it's important when we gather to then have like, okay, so what's the outcome? How are we moving the conversation forward? How are we taking real action? So that was the idea behind coming up with these action steps. So what we are going to now do is we'll be reaching out to all the facilitators to get them consolidated down and given to us, and then we will create a document that we will be putting online and we'll be sharing widely. So all the organizations that participated, we of course will be looking to you as a resource to help disseminate the information, but we've also been talking to a couple of different like media platforms and people who are interested in knowing what were the outcomes of today's forum and the different conversations that happened. So we'll be sharing that out, and really is just to continue to keep this momentum going.